Shooting in manual all the time is not really a truth. I shoot manual less than half the time, and you can too. I'm going to show you how I learned manual mode, and yes, I do use it from time to time, but I don't use it very often. I do a lot of wildlife photography, and the light changes frequently from the sky to the trees to inside the woods, and I cannot make adjustments that fast. So instead of calling it automatic, some folks will tell you if you're not manual, you're an automatic. Well, let's call it semi-manual. So there's aperture priority and there's shutter priority. Those are the two features that you want to pay attention to. Now, stick with me. At the end of this video, I will give you a link or tell you where you can get a download of a cheat sheet of some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So how do you get started getting towards manual mode? Well, number one, it's not just jumping in a manual. I guarantee you will mess up your pictures. That's what happened to me. If you do it and you're successful, congratulations. However, that's not the route we're going to try to take. As I mentioned before, we're going to talk about aperture priority and shutter priority mostly, but let's talk about ISO first. That's part of the triangle. The exposure triangle includes three legs. You got aperture priority, shutter priority, and the ISO. Shutter and aperture are your two most creative dials, or features, or functions, or modes, whatever you want to call them. So ISO is just like a volume knob like we had in our stereos back in the day. If you had them, we'd crank the volume way up. It would distort the sound, and yeah, that's what it did. Does the same thing with light in the camera. You increase the ISO, you're going to introduce noise because you're amplifying the light way too much. So that one does not have a lot of creativity to it. So the objective that we will have in almost every photo that we take or that you want to try to get the ISO as low as possible. All right, so let's talk about shutter and aperture. But before we go any further, if you're getting value out of this, hit like and subscribe. I appreciate it. So let's talk about the aperture and the shutter. The aperture is used to control blur in the background. What's in focus, what's not in focus, depth of field. We'll talk about that in a bit. The other one is shutter. The shutter is used to freeze motion or to introduce blur. So a shutter is just like your eyes opening and closing. How fast do they open and close? If you open and close them real fast, whatever you see, you'll probably see it frozen in place. The camera's no different. The faster the shutter speed, the more frozen it'll be. The slower the shutter speed, the more blur you'll introduce if your subject is moving. Very simple. So you can probably start guessing some fun things you can do with shutter. But right now, we just want to decide how to freeze action and what shutter speeds we want to be in. And that would be in shutter priority. The other mode is called aperture priority. And this one, you might decide which mode you want to be in depending on if you're doing a portrait or maybe a landscape. Those are the two extremes. A lot of photographers that do portraits have a very low aperture, like 2.8, 2.0, 1.8, 1.4. If you get that low, you probably got a pretty expensive lens. But the top end is f11 to f22 or even higher. Those higher numbers, the hole in the aperture gets very, very, very small. And when that happens, more is in focus from front to back. So landscape photographers like f8 or higher, typically around f11. Portrait photographers, 2.0 and less. All right, so grab your camera if you haven't got it already. We're going to look at a sheet. And before we get there, there's two modes that you want to look at. One's aperture priority, the other one's shutter priority. If we put the ISO on 100 and we're in aperture priority, the only thing the camera can adjust is the shutter. So if you can't get enough light, then you're going to have to move the ISO up a little bit. So always remember, I want to shoot at ISO 100, and if I have to, I'll move it up. Play with your camera. I can get up to about 1600 to 2000 and still get a pretty decent photograph. But I still like to stay as close to 100 as possible, but that is an adjustment I can make if the exposure doesn't work. So let's take a look at some examples. So if we look at shutter speed, and we are in shutter priority, that's the left column, it controls motion. You want a shutter speed over 1/1000 if it's something really, 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 really fast, like a bird, kids running, a race car. That's a whole different story. So you probably don't want a fast shutter speed, and we're not going to talk about how to do that today. But if you want a really fast shutter speed, you're probably going to have to move your ISO up just a little bit, and it just depends on where you are. If you're out in a bright sunny day, you definitely can get an ISO over 1/1000 and still have a decent aperture. So when you have shutter priority turned on a Canon camera, it's TV, Sony, Olympus, and all the rest, I think it's the letter S. I wish Canon followed the same, but they did not. But so you're on TV, so that means the camera can only adjust the aperture. You have control of only the ISO and the shutter. So when you move your wheel, the aperture is going to change. Now, something to keep in mind, when you're taking that photo, if you see that aperture flashing, that means you're not getting enough light. So pay attention to what's happening on your screen. So when you have a fast shutter speed and you don't have enough light and your ISO is at 100, your aperture might flash because it cannot get low enough to actually get the photo. So you're going to have to adjust that ISO up just a smidge, just a little bit. Go to 400, go to 800, and see if you can get that to work. If 1/1000 isn't working, maybe try 1/500, and hopefully that's fast enough for your subject. But you can see where I'm going. You start in shutter priority for a fast-moving subject. Maybe it's your kids playing soccer. You probably could get by with 1/250, maybe. But you can try it. But if your kid's playing soccer, unless it's indoor, you probably got good sunshine and should be able to get that 1/1000. So for everyday work, if you go down the line, for everyday work, I start around 1/250. At 1/250, that'll take care of someone walking briskly, doors opening and closing, cars moving at very slow speeds. If you're downtown, taking photos, things like that. All right, so that one you probably do not have to bump the ISO up to past 100. You can probably stay there, but that's an easy one. If it's a cloudy day, you might want to bump it to 200 or 400. Rule of thumb, if your photo is blurry from movement, use a faster shutter speed. That's what you're after. If your photo is blurry from movement, use a faster shutter speed. Just remember that. If you're wanting to freeze action, but your subject is blurry, you probably need a faster shutter speed. All right, so let's go to the second column here. This is aperture priority. Aperture controls background blur, like I mentioned before. A wide open aperture means a small number, means the aperture is really large. And the easy way to remember which is your pupil. When you look at a bright light, it gets very tiny, so it goes down, and that is a small aperture or a larger number like f11. If you go in a dark area and your pupil gets really wide because it's trying to let more light in, and that's a low aperture number. So a low aperture is going to give you blurry backgrounds. So if you're taking a photo and you got a busy background and you want a photo of a group or a person, get your aperture down as low as your camera can possibly go. Now realize that's going to let a lot of light in, so you're definitely most likely going to have an ISO 100. So if you played with your ISO on another day, always remember to reset it down to 100. For medium type situations where it's just general photography, I will usually put my camera on f5.6 or f8, for the aperture. And that's usually a good place to start. If I don't know what to expect, I'll put it in aperture priority, put my aperture on f8, ISO at 100, and I'll take a photo, see what it looks like. I'll look at my histogram. I'll see if my number's flashing, saying I can't get enough shutter speed to actually get the photo. But most likely you're not going to get that because the shutter speeds go all the way down to 30 seconds, and it will let you try to take a picture really slow. So pay attention to your photos. Take a test shot. It's not a problem. For high F numbers, I use that when I want to do landscape, and I'll shoot for F11 or higher. Rule of thumb, if you want the blurry background, use a lower F number. If you want a in-focus background front to back, shoot for high F numbers. All right, I scrolled down just a little bit, and I have a section on ISO, only because it's a part of the triangle, no other reason. But some rule of thumbs: keep the ISO as low as possible, as the rule of thumb says, for the cleanest image possible. If it's a bright day, you could be at 100 to 200 very easily. Indoors, probably 400 to 800, maybe a little bit higher. Rule of thumb, like I said, keep that ISO as low as possible. 3 things before you take the shot. 1, is it sharp? Is it bright enough? Is the background distracting? So before you take the shot, is it bright enough? Is it sharp? Is the background sharp enough? If all 3 are good, then take your photo. So before I cover this green area, I told you I'd ask you a question, and that question is, which of these settings are the most difficult for you to comprehend? Which one do you have the most difficulty setting? So let's look at what I have in the green section. These are just, I call safe settings. If I don't know what to set it to and where am I, where should I start? So if you're outdoors and it's sunny, use aperture priority. and you'll notice all three of mine here say aperture priority. So I always start in aperture priority when in doubt. Have the aperture at 5.6 for a sunny day, ISO at 100, minimum shutter maybe 1/250. So that's where I start. Then I take the photo and I'll adjust my aperture and my shutter speed depending on what I want. So in aperture priority, we only have the aperture control, but when you adjust the aperture, you use that to watch what shutter speed you're getting depending on what you're taking photos of. Remember, fast action freeze, you want 1/1000. So if you're in that situation, I would probably slip over to shutter priority so I can control that. Indoors can come with challenges. You don't know what kind of light you're going to have, if it's going to be dimly lit or it's going to be real bright. So I'll be in aperture priority, aperture f4, because that might be darker than outside, obviously, and ISO 100, and 1/125th is what my goal for my shutter speed. So the ISO is probably the one you're probably going to adjust a little bit. If it's dim in the locations you're taking photos, you're probably going to increase that to you're probably going to increase that to like 1600, and then try that. Action and wildlife, like I said, I do a lot of this. So I set my aperture to 5.6. I put my ISO on auto. This is one time that's really interesting. I put it on auto, and I want a minimum shutter speed over 1/1000. Now I have a video, I'll put a link at the end. I really need to remake it. It's a really corny video of why your photos are blurry. It's a setting I have, and it's usually only on higher end cameras where I can set my camera where it will not go under a specific shutter speed that I want. And I set that to 1/1000. I do have a video that my video does talk to. Let's do this whole section over. Green section over. So before we cover this green section of the slide, like I said, I'll have a link down below in the description for you so you can download it for yourself. But the question I have for you is, what is your most difficulty getting to manual mode, or trying manual mode, or trying one of these semi-manual modes? So here are three setups that I use. If it's outdoors, I'll typically be in aperture priority. I will have an aperture setting of 5.6 and start at ISO 100 and hope for a shutter speed around 1/250. And depending on what I'm taking photos of, I'll adjust as necessary to get the shutter speed that I want. Indoors, I'm going to have an aperture priority again. I'm going to set my aperture to f4, ISO to 800. If it's really dimly lit, I'm going to go up on the ISO. If it's really bright, then I can leave it there or lower it depending on what I'm wanting to get with the aperture setting. So the last one, action and wildlife. I'm in aperture priority. I set the aperture to 5.6. This one I put ISO and auto because, like I said, I'm doing bird photography. I can't keep up with all the settings. And if the bird's moving from light to dark, and I have ISO at 100 and I come to the dark, my camera is not going to be able to be at 1/1000 of a shutter speed because it's gotten so dark. So I'll put the ISO on auto. Now my camera does have a feature that I can say you can't go below 1/1000 of a second. That's usually the higher end cameras. If you don't have that, you'll want to flip the shutter priority so that you can control what shutter speed you have. Again, leave the ISO in auto. You won't have to care about the aperture. It's going to be far enough away. The bird will be in focus. And make sure you stay over 1/1000 for your action, outdoor, wildlife, or whatever is moving fast. So we covered a lot today. If you're enjoying this video, hit the like and subscribe. I appreciate it. This is Doug Gabbard practicing photography, getting better one photo at a time.